For those of you that joined in, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Microsoft List, your smart information tracking app in Microsoft 365. My name is Vlad Kashman, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Before we get started with the amazing content we got planned today, let me do some of the more boring but important housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent to everybody who registered within 48 hours after the webinar. And we encourage you to send it to any friend, colleague, or social media contact you have that might find this useful. And the slides will also be shared. So as soon as you get them, please send them along. We will also encourage you to take this opportunity to ask any questions that you might have around Microsoft List. List is a brand new product, and some of you don't have it in your tenant. Some of you just got it in the past few days. We'll talk more about the rolling out in just a few minutes, but brand new product, and you don't have the chance every day to have a senior product manager from Microsoft on a call with you. So please use the Q&A widget at the bottom and ask all of the questions you have, and we'll do our best. Usually we answer all of them, so please ask all of your questions. Now enough housekeeping, let's go over to the fun stuff. And let me introduce my co-host for this webinar series, Microsoft MVP and good friend, Drew Madelung. How are you doing, Drew?
Good, Vlad. Good. It's been about 2 weeks since we've talked, so it's good to catch up, and especially on this exciting topic here today.
Oh yeah, definitely exciting. But now let's introduce the guest star of the show. I'm sure most of you have already seen him in Microsoft events, Twitter, or tech community, but we're really honored to have Mark Kashman with us today. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Drew and Vlad. And just a note to all of the people that are listening in, if you hear something that you really like, just keep the cheering down a little bit because Drew's newborn is sleeping. So we'll get all the excitement in Microsoft List out there, but we'll just keep it down.
Thanks, Mark.
Let's get started talking a bit about Microsoft List. Drew, first of all, how excited are you about today's topic?
Yeah.
I know you've been super into it.
It's been interesting. So I mean, I come from a business process side. I work with a lot of, I'm a consultant, and I work with a lot of different organizations and enterprises to build solutions on top of Microsoft 365. And whether that's in the Power Platform or mainly my background's all been in SharePoint. So I've been in the world of SharePoint lists and understanding how SharePoint lists work and how they tie different things together. I built some things that probably should never have been built in SharePoint at some point 15 years ago because I trying to build relational solutions together, and so much of the UI work I put in front of data, because really it's about, and working with customers, it's about seeing data and bringing data in more easily to you. So whether it's accounting, I've done multiple accounting projects for people, bringing data out of financial information, bringing data out of a really common one I build is around project management solutions, whether they're high level or some more advanced ones. But you find these solutions that have data, and how easily can you work with that data? How can we add logic to that data? And how can we surface that data and then realistically share it with the appropriate people? So getting that data. So if I'm working with Vlad on how we're scheduling our next set of webinars, right, that's a list of people, times, dates, it's information that we need to track. And we've always kind of tracked that information in SharePoint, and we've seen the evolution of SharePoint in the last, for as long as we've been working with it, but it's always good to continue to see what's next around information management and really content itself. We've seen such a growth of documents and collaboration and sharing and co-authoring and all of the power that you have with that type of document. But when I work with companies, content is content, whether it's data or whether it's documents itself. So I think what I think of this is the new capabilities inside of content, inside of data that we didn't have in the past, that are powered by some of the same functionality that we had before. So branding, new icon, new information, new tools. I personally see a lot of potential kind of coming through this that I've worked with customers on. I instantly thought of some of the projects I did and how I'm going to look back at some of the new rules we can talk about and the calendaring that we can do. So personally, I just love seeing this kind of growth beyond just the documented information that we've seen, because we know that this is where a lot of people do their work. I know, Vlad, I mean, you work with planning your Pluralsight courses and the work you do. You have to track this information somewhere as well.
Oh yeah, and don't get me wrong, I was really excited when List moved from classic to the modern version of List. That was already mind-blowing, being able to add conditional formatting and things like that without any HTML tricks in the back. That, I mean, we could do it before, right? But as you said, you probably build things that shouldn't have been on SharePoint and you build them on List. I don't think you're a SharePoint professional if you didn't build stuff creatively using lists, hidden fields, and some stuff in the back.
Required fields, script links. Yeah, I mean,
yes,
come up with ways to make the data work.
Adding another web part on the view kind of form so you can change how it looks. Yeah, we've all been there. And kind of, especially as I've been working at Valo for 2 years now, and I've been working a lot more with the business folks from marketing, from HR, and less with the IT pros. The ease of use and being able to build stuff easily that looks good as well, it's so important. And I think that from classic to modern list, that was a huge change. But Microsoft List now, at least from the preview and what I've been able to play with so far, really brings it to the level where we don't have marketing people asking us to go to monday.com and can we have a Monday app in Teams. They're going to be happy to follow IT guidance and have everything inside Microsoft.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that too, I think that you trigger one for me for that, is having customers come and say, well, you don't need to know the guts of SharePoint to be able to create a list anymore. Right? You don't need to go into the world of content types and field names and things like that sometimes you might have had to, and it would kind of push some people away, which is not necessarily needed because it was all technically there, and all of that is still there, but it's about empowering. For us, I see empowering more people to be able to work with data that they didn't have in the past, and not having it kind of be as buried as it has been or could have been buried unless someone kind of took a little bit more of an effort to resurface it up.
To make it pretty and put it back up, like in an easy to find hub.
Absolutely. And I mean, Mark, we're kind of talking there. I mean, is that from our approach, how did that kind of start in some of the conversations, maybe at the highest level when the concept of lists really started to percolate on your side, Mark?
Yeah, I think that, I hear you talking about the classic to modern, that move a number of years ago was for the whole of SharePoint. And it really was to focus on getting people to have to build less. There's always the notion of a platform. There's always scenarios that require more customization or more levels of complexity. But it really was, like you're saying, a move away from, or to add a different tool set on the same platform that makes it easier for everyone, so that there is less UI that you have to build. You can just configure it, or you will get it out of the box. A lot of the pain that people had in terms of just navigating, where is my list? That was a big pain point, and whether it was classic or modern, it doesn't matter. It was sort of tucked away. And for those that are comfortable with SharePoint and how to locate, whether you have put it as a left nav, when you created the list in the first place, or if you have to navigate the site contents to get to your lists of lists and libraries and whatnot, to give you a central location that not only just shows you here's all your lists, but then takes advantage of the Microsoft Graph, which means it's a personalized experience. I sign in, Mark, I see my lists, ones that have been shared with me, ones that are most recently active with other people or myself. Some of the other things that are new is just taking advantage of the ability to create a personal list versus something that maybe by default starts with a team. There's lots of things that people manage on their own by the means of what their role is. At a point in time, you may want to have something a little bit more private versus public. So there's this notion of being able to create a personal list, but none of it breaks the boundaries of where we've come from. So the expectation was, or I would say one of the most common questions was, are you moving away from SharePoint lists? Which both has, depending on how you're asking it, possibly a negative or a positive connotation to the question. But I think it's mostly positive. And a lot that what people are really asking is, are we starting over again? You said classic to modern, and there was some give and take when we moved to modern. And even though this feels like postmodern, and I know we're having this talk on a Monday here just shortly after we've released, but the reality is it's an evolution of what's currently in product. There is only one Microsoft product focused on lists. We call it Microsoft Lists, but it's the same experience and the same platform if you create from within inside SharePoint. I'll show you today creating inside Microsoft Teams or the new Lists app in Microsoft 365. It is a place where anybody can leverage a template, start from scratch, pull in an Excel spreadsheet, create it for their own purpose of managing their information, or to have it as a part of a team. And it's a really beautiful design canvas that has all the smarts from the history, years and years and millions of people using lists, is really just evolving into something that brings a lot of new capabilities, a new user interface, and addresses a lot of those common pain points that we've seen over the years.
So, Mark, do you want to take over the sharing and show us all of this
Sure.
nice stuff? We
Yeah.
have, I see 182 people on, and I'm sure, you know how our webinars are. People love demos. So
I do. So that was going to be my question. I've got 3 starting points. I can start with just what are Microsoft lists, the one slide that helps define a little bit. You'll see it in demos no matter where we start. And then I've got this slide that's just sort of tucked away down here, which is about 10 common questions that most likely may already be in the chat. But I could cheat
yes,
ahead and
having
answer some
seen that
questions.
slide, let's start
Yeah.
with that slide. I think that will
Okay.
set a good foundation for the rest.
All right, well, I'll put this into view mode so we can see it full screen, and I just have to swap. But next to our smiling faces here, these are the most common questions I've been getting either on comments in the blog, certainly as internal and external people pinging me through Twitter or through Teams or Yammer or whatnot. So I just started to write them out and hopefully in a short format where you can kind of see the answer. But I'll just talk about a few of these. And if you have any comments along the way, or if you see people have already asked questions a little bit differently, we can clarify that. We'll have time at the end as well. But I've already mentioned, and you sort of led with it, that this is an evolution of SharePoint lists, which for security and compliance is a great thing because it already is compliant with all the same surveys and whatnot that we take to certify Microsoft 365. So for security and compliance officers, lists don't break out into any new zones. It is SharePoint. It is SharePoint within Microsoft 365. And if you know SharePoint lists, it's essentially where they are stored. And a lot of the work is to abstract so that you can aggregate and see all of your lists, work with them a little bit more in a friendly way. And later this year, we'll introduce a lists mobile app. And you can imagine that will aggregate and give you lots of capabilities when you're on the go. But it is an evolution of SharePoint, which also means functionality, all the features that you've liked in the past don't immediately go away because we've modernized something. They are there plus. The next one that I get a lot is how does this compare with Planner or To Do, which I think is mostly a visual. I don't want to call it a misperception because it's a great thing to take a nod to. Microsoft Lists looks a little bit more user-friendly or looks a little bit like To Do or Planner. But Microsoft Lists is not a task app. Planner and To Do are focused on either your individual tasks or your team tasks that typically get assigned to somebody, and once they're done, they're kind of away from your view, and you move on to the next task. Where you all both know, and I think a lot of people out in the field know how people can build on lists for hundreds, if not thousands of types of scenarios. The real extreme that certainly isn't a task-oriented one is one that we saw with one of our customers that essentially was managing about 500 trucks, and the association to the truck was the driver, the equipment with the truck, which one of them was a device, an iPad that they had put in with every truck, and they were tracking of who had what truck when, was the truck in repair, did it need repair, and it was a place where they could log issues with the truck. And so it was a way to manage trucks at scale with hundreds of drivers and about a team of 10 that were helping manage both not just the IT side of it, but the actual truck maintenance. And it was all managed on a list, and it had a nice front end that they had built using a Power App. And that's still possible today. It's still a very common scenario that we see for tracking assets, but again, not just a task. The one that I'll kind of jump to, and I think a lot of them you can read ahead and kind of get the sense of what the answer is, but I know a lot of people are asking about availability, and I'm glad that you and Drew have been able to get a hold of Microsoft Lists and start playing with some of the capabilities. There are a lot more to come. But as far as rollout is concerned for production, we started with targeted release. That was just a couple of days ago, essentially. That was the end of July, July 28th. But the clarity is we will be in targeted release until the end of August, which means you may, even if you're in targeted release, you may not have it yet. I believe we're just moving from 10% to 50% this week. And we'll just start to incrementally move up like we do with all features. This is not new for Microsoft Lists. But if you're in targeted release, you can assume by end of August, you will have Microsoft Lists. And that primarily is the Lists homepage, which I'll show you, and the new templates and the new create experience, in addition to being able to create a personal list. And we'll talk about more to come. As we move into production, once we move through targeted release, it'll take us about another month to get to all clouds. And this is not just full worldwide 100% production, that's the goal, but it does include education, enterprise, and government clouds. So without draining this slide completely, if there are any questions that you've seen in the chat or that you commonly get that aren't on here, if you have one or two you want to ask now, or we can save them till later. But again, this is kind of a view on a cheat to say these are the most common questions I've seen with the short answer here.
I'll ask two questions. First of
Sure.
all, one that we get often, when you mention GCC, is it
Mm-hmm.
all of the GCC?
It is.
Or, okay, so I think that having that same infrastructure as SharePoint and not a new product makes it super easy in a way for you guys to say, we're not implementing, yeah, your data is stored in the same location that you already approved,
Correct.
using the same permissions, DLP, all of that same compliance infrastructure. Okay.
And I'll show you just from the sense of when you see a list through the new UI of the Microsoft Lists home, you can drill into it and you'll see that it's just a list as a part of a SharePoint. I'll show you two ways to kind of visually and technically prove that, but it is how it's being built. And so as they evolve, if, let's just say this, if a government entity, whether it was GCC, GCC High, or DoD, allowed and are using lists today, there is nothing in Microsoft Lists that changes why they would want to have it go through a further review or take a little bit longer to get further compliance. It is the same platform, the same data container, and the new capabilities are primarily on making it easier, faster, and of course new capabilities, but from where the data is stored, which is the most important compliant notion. Yeah, it doesn't change, and our goal is to roll out to all clouds in as fast a fashion as we can, and that does include all forms of government.
Awesome.
So
Now
Mark,
I said, Drew,
yeah, there's one. So I wanted to make sure we touch on the task app one, because there were some questions out there just to say. So one of the things I know that differentiates, or that has come up, and I've had questions asked and came up here too, is around calendaring.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, like, that from an evolution we've seen of SharePoint in the past, what has happened with modern, being able to see certain things and having better calendaring there. We now, with modern team sites, we have the group calendars. What about calendaring inside
Mm-hmm.
of lists?
Yeah, so the list team takes the approach that you might want to visualize your data in a number of unique ways. And they have both the approach of templatizing so that you can have a quicker time to market with getting started, which helps you visualize your list in terms of what type of data are you tracking. And there's also the notion of different views. And you both probably have created hundreds, if not thousands, of custom views or used out-of-the-box views. The three that we're shipping, but the one that you're asking about comes just a few weeks later. The three that we're shipping are grid view, which is commonly kind of like you see here. This looks a little bit like grid view, rows and columns. Then there is the gallery view, which takes the notion of more of like a card layout. and it maybe assumes that there's an image, but you don't have to have an image, but it puts it into a card layout, and then every row becomes a card. So it's just another way to visualize. And the calendar view that we're bringing does just that. If anywhere in your column structure, your data schema, there's date information per list item, it helps to visualize from a calendar view, what does this look like if we have a week-long event, like our friends at Valo Fest for the day, if they had a longer term event, or we know the Collab 365 team does the 4 to 5 day events. If you imagine though, you're putting on an internal event and you wanted to visualize, we've got all the sessions marked out from 9 to 5 across these 5 days. You could essentially pull up that as a calendar view, put it into week view mode of the calendar, and visualize it as a calendar. The one point of clarity though, which is possibly why the question is being asked, is it's not necessarily a calendar that you subscribe to. It is not based on an Exchange calendar. It is not doesn't have the ability to do an overlay. It's just simply a way to visualize if you have date information, how are we tracking, and do we have it all balanced out across a calendar view? And it'll have day view, week view, and month view.
As you said that, the question came in if it can be synchronized with Outlook.
Yep.
I think it was at the exact same moment that you said it.
There will be ways to take your lists with you, and that is partially the mobile app and some other things we're thinking about. But take into consideration that we're not leveraging the calendar technology in Exchange. It's just a list that's visualized with a unique user interface, and the ones that we're thinking about are pretty commonly what people build. So the other kind of half to Drew's statement earlier around what's new with Microsoft Lists and how does it build on that common platform that we've known for years, it is just that. And it's the same with when you think of modern SharePoint. What are the things that people have built and spent a lot of money on to achieve what is really nice user interface, but maybe isn't really business critical? The one example I throw out there is, imagine a really beautiful portal that somebody built, but classic SharePoint didn't have out of the box responsive design. So it looks great on a 17 or above inch monitor, but you get down to a tablet, a phone, and it really starts to fall apart. With modern SharePoint, you don't have to build it because it's built in. And that's that same notion with lists. Not only are they responsive, we already have that kind of in the notion of if you took it today without the mobile app, but to really put it into a mobile application so that the same thing that I'll show you in the next thing to show you kind of the lists home experience, all of that functionality to create a list, to use a template, to edit a list, to access and view and share a list will all be possible through the mobile application without you having to build it. And that's a big important part of the work that our team is doing so that you don't have to build out just common user interface or common access points. The other one being Microsoft Teams, that new create experience in Teams. We've already had the ability to bring an existing list, so you could do a lot of work in SharePoint and bring in the list as a tab in Teams. But what I'll show you today is the actual creation inside of Teams with that same ability. So if you think we're beyond FAQs, obviously we can spend a ton of time answering questions.
We can spend so much time on questions.
Yeah. As you transition, Mark, I got one for you as you flip over because this one should be easy. Licensing.
So this is a pretty easy one for me because when I think of licensing, I think of you don't have to have additional licensing if you're a Microsoft 365 customer. The way you get Microsoft Lists is you, as an end user, have one license of Microsoft 365 that includes SharePoint. So SharePoint standalone licensing as an end user. It's not very common, obviously, these days, but that would be the base component. If you have access to SharePoint, you have access to Microsoft Lists. Holistically, we just talk about that any plan that includes SharePoint in Microsoft 365, whether it's enterprise, education, government, even first-line workers would have access to leverage and use lists. Just to give you a sense here, it'll just be a new list icon that shows up, but it's bound by where you're actually storing the data, where you actually put your information is technically SharePoint. So if you don't have SharePoint instantiated, meaning that license that at least includes SharePoint, then we don't have a place to put the list, so you wouldn't have the list capabilities. But it's not an additional cost. It is just going to appear in terms of same thing with OneDrive. If you invest in the suite, there is no level of, you can certainly buy OneDrive as a standalone, that's the only difference. But it's really built on the same platform. OneDrive's built on SharePoint, lists are built on SharePoint, and SharePoint is SharePoint. So that's the base component.
Makes sense.
But as far as demo, let me click through a few things, and if it prompts any ideas or thoughts on your end, just go for it. But just to be real clear, this is real Mark. This is in my Microsoft tenant, and the way it shows up for me is it's a new app in Microsoft 365 that I've bookmarked, and I've got a few things as shortcuts in my Edge so I can get there quicker. But this is about the quickest way you can get to lists for the first time. You'll see it here appear, or I've seen a few people get really clever and try to trick the system if they don't have it yet. Vlad, I'm sure you've got a couple of posts already about how to do that in whack layout, something OneDrive, click and click.
I might have retweeted a few, but I did not post them.
Yeah. Anyway, so for those that are clever and know their way around SharePoint, there may be some ways. I'll encourage you to just be patient because I know they're rolling out now. But here I've clicked lists, and that's where I'm at. I'm at the aggregation of all my lists. And some of these are new that I've built out just for some demos. Some are ones that I really use, and I'll show you a few. But as I scroll down, you'll see that lists for me have only been accessible within the last few weeks outside of just some early mocks and a really early environment. But some of these are really old lists that I use to track a lot of information that I've been doing for years. One of them is the podcast that I co-host with Chris McNulty. This is where we plan and manage all of our shows, and I'll scroll quickly through some of the upcoming ones. But these are all just date driven. When the date passes, it turns green. If it hasn't come up yet, which I'll kind of show you a little hint of one that's coming here, it's yellow, and then on the day of, it's blue. But it's a really easy way for me to track who was on our show, what episode, the blog I put in here as a new link, and that's a pretty simple scenario for tracking content, like a content schedule. Another one that I manage is the actual lists roadmap, and I can start here pretty comfortably, and I'll show you two scenarios that I use that start to show you a little bit about what's going on here. One is actually a rule that I've built. So you can create rules, and this one I get a notification when the status is changed by another person to needs roadmap ID. So if you can imagine a future item that they're planning for lists, when they're ready to actually make it public, meaning that they're willing to share that, yes, we're committing to that plan to build that feature, they'll flag it as needs roadmap ID, and guess who gets the email? So to create this rule, and I'll show you one example, is pretty simple. There are rule templates, and I use this one, a column value changes to something. But I'll just put on here if a new item is created. When a new item is created, and that's just it, that's the action, send an email, and you can do it by other columns. So I could send an email to the PM, which is a little recursive, send an email to themselves. But here I also want to help manage this as best I can as their marketing peer. When a new item is created, email me. And I create this, and now it's a new rule that I can turn on or off that the team will benefit from. If I had put somebody else's name or a group value, I could put in a group alias. And here I'm just creating a simple rule off a template. And again, I'll kind of pause here and just show you the template gives you a lot of the abilities to build out lightweight rules that you could imagine that really are focused on notifying people when certain criteria are met. And they can be really simple things. They can get more complex with the first two. But it's a really nice rules engine. This is one of the FAQs. This part of our kind of a basic flow is not based on Power Automate. This is just really driven off of the list schema and when there are changes. So it's very local and doesn't require Power Automate. For more complex flows, we do integrate with Power Automate and of course with Power Apps to build out custom forms and of course to build custom flows. But the rules part of it is one of those things that's new that comes with lists, but these are just lists like any other. The other way that I use it, and this is just sort of my flow, is I go in and you all in the community might know Chax. Chax is one of the lists program managers, and I'll apply some of the things that Chax is working on. And here I can get a quick view of what are some of the things that are out there in the market that Chax owns. What are some of the things that we announced at Build, which is essentially any Microsoft Lists item. He owns rules and some of the forms customizations features. So these are on the public roadmap. They have a public roadmap ID. and I've listed out what the status is. This is just for us to track and manage. And then once we've launched it, we typically put it either in a monthly roll-up blog or something that maybe if it's a bigger feature like we did with Lists Home and the templates, we of course have a unique launch there. So, but I can also see information that I've programmed into this as a condition if the date that we set that's first to roll out in targeted release is overdue, basically. I have it just simply here to highlight it as red, to put a little icon that looks like a hazard in the road, and this is for me to follow up with checks. And I'll be real transparent on the call today. This is just that I haven't updated the item. We are working on some of the new message center items about some of the new configuration of where you'll find your automating rules. But anyway, just an example of how you can filter, how you can add conditions, and some of the new ways that what it looks like is when you go in to edit something like a choice field. This used to be a few clicks and a lot of work with JSON or not even being able to do it if that's not your skill set. But now I can go in, this is the name of the column. I can adjust the different colors. I can adjust the fill. I could adjust what it says. I can add new choices. And this is just the new modern way to add and adjust a choice field. But what's nice in some of the templates, like the one that I used here, it came pre-populated with the actual choices and the color schema. And I'll show you that as far as getting started. One other list that I'll hint at and then I'll pause if there's any questions from you or from anybody just on this list is what I'm seeing here are lists that I've favorited. And then below here is a collection of recent lists or my lists, ones that I've created in that personal storage space within Microsoft 365. And it's just an initial way to navigate all of my lists, especially ones that I'm most actively engaged on, either by favoriting them or seeing them here at the top, with the recent one being the fun one of working with Vlad and team. This is a recreation of the full VoloFest agenda, color coding for the different tracks that they had, which is something that if you wanted to, you could group by session type and see all the experience tracks, see all the happy hour stuff. Vlad, I'll pause here. Did you join every happy hour, all 3 happy hours?
No, I only joined the Americas one.
All right.
The timing on the other ones was a bit tough.
Yeah, I don't know how happy 2 in the morning is, but something tells me that that Drew's daughter might have helped him join the APAC one, waking up whenever she does. But if you can see in here, obviously, this is where I had my keynote listed. And even on top of this one, some of what gets fun is your ability to obviously see and manage this form, especially if you're an owner. You can go in and edit the columns that show up. You can reorder them, and soon you'll be able to start rules that actually hide or show information based on logic on just if a date is younger than 5 days, we don't need to see a note or something. If it's older than that, show the notes and why something's been delayed more than 5 days, something like that.
And Mark, with rules, I want to make sure we really are clear on that. So it was in the FAQs, but rules are not based on Power Automate, correct?
Rules, as they are that I showed you with the 4 templates and the way to design it like a sentence, that is not Power Automate. It doesn't instantiate and do Power Automate on the back end. It literally is just a tracking mechanism that's tied to when a change is made on the list, like a status if I changed it from in development to rolling out. That might send a notification to the roadmap team, which is what I want to work on next with them. I can't click into it, but one of the most heavily used lists that I have besides managing with the individual teams is this one here. It's called MSETS features, which is a cryptic name for saying we actually manage the full Microsoft 365 roadmap that you see on the public site. It's now managed as this giant list across, I think, hundreds of product managers, but also in concert with our engineering peers for when they say that, yes, that's the valid date, and timing with message center posts and whatnot. But it also has a really heavily managed process that if I add a new item, a whole lots of things happen. If an item changes, especially date driven, that triggers a number of different things. But some of the rules that they're starting to build, and actually they've built some custom buttons that leverage the new rules. They're kind of doing some internal working with our engineering team and our actual IT team, Microsoft IT. And they're building off of those, not because they don't want to use Power Automate, because it's simply just tracking a change on a column and sending a simple notification or a chat into Teams. Beyond that, if we need to do more serial set of actions that go out to other sources of information to then pull in and do all the things that Power Automate enables, there is the ability to then leverage Power Automate, which takes you to the Power Automate flow design canvas, the same as you could go into the Power Apps design surface. But for where we start to leverage flow and Power Apps is really more simplified than that. Just if you need a more complex flow, that's pretty straightforward. And Power Apps really gives us a design surface to further customize the out-of-box view or edit form. Or if you're starting to build kind of a simple application that you want to embed on a SharePoint page. There's a lot that you can do quickly, but certainly if you go fully into the design surface of a Power App designer, you may start from scratch and start to navigate to the list. We assume that there's some easy actions people want to do to customize, some of which may require the Power Platform. And as they're building some of the common things that people do, it's a little closer to home and doesn't require that extra skill set and doesn't require the jump to another technology.
I'm going to ask.
With the Power Automate side, are there any different connectors that are coming, or right now if we're working with lists, they'd be working with the SharePoint connectors back into lists, correct?
Yep, it's identically the same. That's one area where, good and bad, obviously we want to innovate there. We've got some ideas. But when you go to a list, and you saw it when I was on a list, this connection, if I wanted to create an app, that's what's available today in SharePoint lists. So it's still there. The ability to customize the forms, whether that's the view or the edit form, you can do it here, or if you actually go into an item and you choose to customize it with Power Apps, you can do that same as you could before. And that's primarily where our focus is to make sure, A, that it carries over, because that's the plan, and B, there's a lot of want to from feedback that we hear to keep this in the same user interface, so I'm not kicked out. And there's some work going on there that we're really excited about that I have nothing to share except for we know what people are trying to accomplish. And if they are leveraging a list, and maybe there's a grow up nature to it because it starts to take on more people, more complexity, but relatively the information itself is relatively flat, that's an easy way to make that connection. Where you see automate is really where you start to, like it sounds like, do simple things like set a reminder. And here it's even given me a trigger. I didn't build this, to set a reminder off the targeted release date. And that's just for me to set an alert like I could in the past, just a little bit easier to do, fewer clicks away to create the rule I showed you, manage your rules. But ultimately, if I need Power Automate to create a custom flow, it's right there. And of course, if somebody else had built a flow that maybe with the change in a reorg, some of the elements of people changed, I could go in the flow as the owner of the list, change the who gets notified, and be happy with that. That's primarily Lists Home. If you see any other questions that sort of revolve around here, the thing that I really want to show you, but I'll show you the execution of it within Microsoft Teams to really drill into that point, is the ability to create a list. So if people have been around in the SharePoint community for a while, have leveraged lists and have loved lists in the past, you're going to love them even more. Some of this should sound and look familiar, because it is. You can build a blank list today in SharePoint. You can do the same things from the Lists Home and from within Microsoft Teams. We just, before we released Microsoft Lists, as far as the new experience, released the ability to create a list from an Excel table data. And so, of course, that carries through. And there's a lot of great lists that are already out there in your intranet that you can steal from. And it's not the data you're borrowing, it's the list schema, the color coding. In the future, it'll bring in rules and forms, that kind of thing, which I think is one talking point that may have been asked in the chat, and I'll sort of jump to it, as people are asking, all right, I see that you're starting here with 8 ready-made templates. What about custom templates? What about company-owned templates like you have for sites, like you have for Teams templates? And there's absolutely within plan the want, and again, in planning, to enable custom list templates. But you can start to see what is the plumbing that we want to tap into. We want to do it in a modern way. We want to do it in a way that makes sense for those that have worked with some of the templating technology, with Teams, with SharePoint sites, with site designs. We want to learn from that and, of course, adhere to what do people need in list templates. We've got 8 ready-made ones, and just to show you a little bit of what they look like, the one that I had used to build out the Valo Fest was leveraging the event itinerary template. And this is now in product, so if you have it, you'll see the same thing. This is a way to get started, and this is just a way to visualize what it is you get. We assume there's going to be a session name, a code. When I had mentioned earlier about pre-populating the choices of a choice field, these will actually be there until you change them. What session type? Is it a meal, or like Valo had changed it to happy hour, keynote, breakout, workshop, those kinds of things. And to the left, you also see the common things that people track for events. Start time, the duration once you've input that data, capacity of a room, or if it were a digital event, capacity of the product that you're using, if there were limits, those kinds of things. All of this is configurable, and all of this is to help you get started. So these columns will be pre-populated, the logic behind the data will be pre-populated, and it adheres to the scenario, but you're not bound to not being able to change it. You can further configure or customize. So if I use this template, and we'll look at a different one and then start. This is the asset manager. So if I wanted to manage some assets, whether they're physical or virtual, I'll use this, and we'll call this the Vlad and Drew manager. We're going to manage you guys for a second.
It's going to be tough, I'm telling you.
So if anybody in the community knows Drew's favorite color these days, with you know, a youngster, Drew, does your daughter already have a favorite color by chance?
Actually, red. I feel like, yeah, so she kind of gravitates to some of the red stuff.
Gotcha.
But that grandma wears, and
we'll do red and maybe a piggy bank, since you might be savings for future education experiences. But in creating this list, regardless of which template I chose, I can now choose to put this in a specific zone. I can keep it in my list, which leverage the personal storage. It'll be my list until I share it, which I'll show you in a second. Or I can put it in one of these spaces that I work in, which you've seen me talk about, the lists roadmap. That's in our Microsoft Lists team space, which of course has a connected SharePoint team site, which is where that list lives. Here's the Interzone, which is the podcast that I co-host. That's where I put our podcast tracker. But for now, I'll just put it in my list and hit create. And this will create now. It'll put the data structure, the schema, into my personal storage. And as you see here, I get this ability to start building out my lists. And I'll just add one item, and you can help me fill in what the asset tag information is. I'll just kind of make up some things. We'll put in an image here that we used for our webisode, and the status of this. We'll have this in use since we're delivering it right now. The manufacturer, which do you prefer, Fabricam, Tray, or Contoso?
Contoso always.
All right.
So the model number, I think.
Obviously I can fill out a lot of this. We'll make this a laptop, and the color is dark blue, or sorry, you said red. Was red choice here?
It is
the
red.
Color? Yeah, there it is. And there's a lot more information that I could fill out and start to put in actual owners. And I'll put in myself as the current owner, so you can see how we can do a gal lookup. I could name a number of people, associated date. We'll just put in today's date. Or actually it's due tomorrow, so we'll get this out as soon as possible, and then I'll save that down. And then once it's saved to the list, you'll see that the information will come through kind of pre-populated and pre-formatted, and may have some rules and smarts behind it, that instead of in use, if I had matched it to retired, that might gray out or remove this as an option for somebody to request the asset. But you can see here's the image now in SharePoint. You can kind of track down where it gets stored in site assets associated to this list. And it's just a JPEG like any other. But it's a part of the list. And when I go into the form, obviously I'm starting to build this list, and it lives in my list. And that's a reference here where it says my lists. But let's switch over to Microsoft Teams. And for this one,
so as you transfer here, one that's come up multiple times here, the concept of my lists and shared lists, right? So when you create my lists, they're created in your personal site. They're only accessible to you. And I know we're going to talk about sharing, but what if, so you created our wonderful manager here. What if we wanted to, can you move that list at all? Is there, or what is the options? Like if I have this list here,
Yep.
Is the idea to share, or is the idea if I want to take this and I want to move it to the intrazone site?
Yep. So
what are the thoughts for this?
The notion is initially to share, and we don't want to be limited to that. We know that there's some work to be done based on some requests that we've seen, even before Microsoft Lists, is give me an easy way to manage my list and give me an easy way to move my list or combine lists. And that's some initial feedback we're getting specific to Microsoft Lists in the personal space. I've been using it for a little while. I've shared it with a few people, but it's really now for the team to own and manage. And we don't yet have an easy way to move. We have an easy way to share, which is what I'm showing you here, that if I wanted to share with my colleague, Bill Bear, I can easily do that by doing a global address lookup. I can give him both edit, view, or full control, which means he's just as much an owner. This is really mimicking the same controls that we have available in SharePoint when you give people access to a site or a document library or a file. It's really going off of that same backend service, which is our sharing notion. I can add a message and that would send them an email with a link, and of course they have access. It also means that it'll start to show up on their list's home experience, which is what you're seeing here behind. So we do have the notion to share. We do think that there's a lot of scenarios that will start to come up where people will have to choose where do you put the list in the first place. The same as with a file. If I have a file that I know that I want to have access to the team members, I might start it in the team space, but I also might start it in my OneDrive and then use a move to or a copy to. And so some of that thinking certainly is there for the platform for us to build on, but it's also wanting to first understand we're just now introducing the ability to more easily share a list, and I'll show you the ability to share a list item, and then of course have conversation right side by side. So we're getting started with that level of sharing. When it comes to more the IT governance, both are governable because you can govern your personal space, you can govern a team space, of course, already. But that notion of moving things around, there are complexities. As you know, with our migration partners, they have the ability to move a list from on-premises into a team space. So the logic is there, the capabilities are there, the lists API, of course, is available to us as it is to our partners. But as far as an end user ability to do a move or a copy type scenario, we're not quite there yet.
Since you have that pane open, can you actually share to a group as well, or
Yep.
only direct people?
Now I believe, and I'll kind of start to, I'll just share it with all of Microsoft. But my group that I manage for where I store the Microsoft List roadmap items, I called that team Microsoft Lists, and this is the alias to the Microsoft List members. So yes, you can share to a group, you can share to an individual, and of course, once you're sharing, you can also revoke for those that you've shared to. So there's a lot in terms of sharing the list. The common entry point is from here, which is the ability to either share, or the other option is to change the name. So think about past SharePoint lists, how you would change the name, the impact of changing the name and what that would do, and of course the ease of doing it, from list to list to list. So we make it really easy. The change also doesn't affect the URL, so access doesn't change with the list name being changed. When we were using Microsoft Lists as a team before we locked down on the name Microsoft Lists, we had a project name, and that project name was the name of the site that I originally created, both for Teams, the SharePoint Connected site, and then the lists that we started to manage. And I really had 3 lists that I managed from the same space: the roadmap items, all of the deliverables that we're now working on, that's this launch checklist basically. And I also worked with our social team to build out the tweets and all that. So I had a tweets list. Anyway, with the name change, the second that we locked down and we got the approval from legal and PR and my leadership team to go with Microsoft Lists, I named the list. As soon as I had the icon, I updated the icon in the site, and all is good. So anything else around list home or sharing or?
Yeah, I'm gonna queue you up for sharing in chat here, because so there's been a couple of questions, actually multiple questions around permissions and sharing.
Yeah.
And want to make sure everyone's clear. It is using SharePoint sharing. So for anyone, I think for any of the administrators or IT professionals that are kind of listening here, it uses the same sharing logic that if you're sharing documents, sharing sites, that kind of stuff, it's all the same. So if you want to hear more about sharing, you could actually watch our most recent webinar that we did with Stephen Rice,
Hey.
where we went pretty deep into sharing and some of the capabilities, like kind of how link-based sharing is working. But it is using SharePoint-based permission models for this stuff, whether it's on your My Site or your personal site or your team site.
Yeah, and if it gives you any sense of calm, when I was writing some of the initial what is the sharing that we're introducing and how does it work, which is really simple at this stage, we'll have help documentation and of course the kind of step-by-step coming soon. But I actually consulted with Stephen and his peer Raphael, who co-own, from a files experience is how a lot of people know them, but they really own the sharing backend that is used to share sites, used to share files, lists, pages, news, you name it. Anything that is a content within the content service that is the SharePoint backend that powers a lot of these new experiences, files and teams, lists and Microsoft Lists, and the lists of what SharePoint powers goes on and on. Balancing on that common sharing experience. You've heard us probably say that a million times in how we promote the sharing experience in Teams, in OneDrive, in SharePoint. You're absolutely right to say it's based on that same thing, with the little nuance that what it is I'm sharing is a different content type. So it may have a couple of different things and ways that are sharing, and we get a lot of questions on what a lot of people would like in that area. But the most common thing is I want to share a list and I want to share an individual list item. So let's take a look at just creating a list in Microsoft Teams. And I hope this will be good use of the last few minutes, and then we can open up to some questions. But the way that we have today is when you go into a Teams channel, I'm in the freelance team on the general channel, and I'm just going to add a tab. What was available before, you see here what is listed as lists beta, just by nature of internally, and with some of our early adopters, we're working on this, just from a beta phase, but this will be coming by end of month, this month, August. When you click into it, it used to be just choose from a list of lists from this connected team site that you can bring in. But what I'm really doing is adding a new app to Microsoft Teams, and the app happens to be driven by Microsoft Lists. So even though this looks a little bit different than our starting point from the list home, I get the same capabilities to create a list from scratch or using the templates. That's what I'll show you. Or I can, like before, bring in an existing list, the same as I could before. If I have 5 or 6 that are already developed and being used, I can just bring those in as a tab in Teams. But to create new, this is where we really assume, no, you're scratch, you're building a net new list, either as blank from Excel, from existing lists. And as I go through these, hopefully it looks like what I just showed you, because it is. It's the same control with the same logic. The one thing that here that it assumes is because I'm in the freelance team that has a freelance team site associated to it, I don't get the option to put it into my personal space. This will just get stored on the back end into the connected SharePoint site. So if I were to go in and create from a template, you see that you get a glance ahead of what this is. I'll quickly use the template, and I'll just put in here Drew's baby sleeping scheduler.
Every 1 hour.
Every 1 hour. Okay, every hour. Yikes. And we did the piggy bank last time. Now we'll see if she likes robots coming from outer space. So anyway, again, I haven't left Teams. I'm still in Teams, and I'm now starting a new list. I have the ability to go into Quick Edit. Some of the things that you don't see here yet, which we're working on, is the Power Automate and the Power Apps notion. But I could go into SharePoint if I needed that today for this list and build a custom form or build a custom flow. When I'm back in Teams, I'm in Teams, but for the most part, for people just tracking information and adjusting columns and putting in logic and color formatting and conditional formatting, that's all there and it's all possible. And I'll show you kind of one that I've already pre-populated, just so you can kind of see a little bit. This is our remote response list that's managed in the same site. And you'll see that we're leveraging some of the choice fields, some of the authors, some of the logic of if something's older than X date and how many days old is it, highlight it, border it with red, and put the yield icon. This ticket is something that's connected to another system. It's just a link to that ticketing system for the specific ticket. And hopefully you get the sense of this scenario. It's pretty straightforward. But if I wanted to go into the quarterly live event, And here, I might have a question that I know my peer, Alex Wilbur, has the answer to. I'll say @mention Alex, and that does the global address lookup with the @mention as you would expect. Can you check the due date on this one? And then you won't be able to hear it because it's in my ear right now, but Alex essentially would get a notification in his Teams instance. So just visually, I'm going to switch over to another browser where Alex is signed in, and it's on this same freelance team, same general channel in the posts. And here is that @mention from Megan. Can you check the due date on this one? And this is where I think it's really nice round tripping. And the final thing I'll land on is, as Alex now, when I click on this item, I'm not taken to the list, I'm taken to the list item and the chat side by side, so I can review the information, I can see what Megan was saying, and I could actually even go in and say, yeah, the due date looks a little off. It's actually coming the following month on the 24th. And as a member of this site, I have the ability to go in and save this information, make an adjustment, adjust maybe the priority is not high, it's actually something a little bit different. We'll put it as normal. And you can see it's saving on the back end, going back to the list. If I want to go to the full list as Alex, I can now see that that information was changed, and I can reply back to Megan and let her know that all is good. But the real value here is I'm within Teams, I'm a member of this team, and where we're working with our data, whether it's files, whether I had brought in another list where I have here the storefront approvals. And the reason why I want to end on this one is you can of course have multiple lists in the same zone. And this particular list, I'll show you one of my favorite features with lists and in Teams is the ability to expand. So I can see more columns. I could adjust the view if I really wanted to take advantage of it. But I'll click into, let's see, do we have any of the cities where you guys live? I think the closest we get, I think we're very West Coast on this one. So we'll just do Palo Alto. But you can see one example here where we've actually customized the view form with Power Apps. So we use some of the column data. If this one hadn't yet been approved, there's actually a button where you could click approve here that would then trigger an automate workflow. We visualize the image a little bit bigger, and then we're actually pulling information from Power BI. So hopefully this is a really good example, not just the integration of Power Apps on lists in Teams, but it is actually showing you the value of when you would need a Power App. You would need it to combine information, to have a logical place to click and trigger a workflow based on some action. And then this data down here is actually being pulled from a separate Excel spreadsheet that's doing and being used for analysis, but here to visualize some of what the current total amount is, or whatever the scenario would dictate. So I think it's a nice solution. This is a solution for a retail scenario where at this store, they're managing what the new window dressing will look like in each store, what they're going to highlight in each window for that month, and obviously to work with the different store owners and trigger certain actions. Once it's been approved or once they have it up and running, they can validate, take a picture of it, add it to the list, and have that be an ongoing list, not just a checklist. Yes, I've updated the window dressing, but ownership, how's it doing? Is it affecting sales? And that's the analysis part, those kinds of things. I know we're at time, and I'll stop demoing and bring up sort of the last slide that we can then talk to in terms of additional questions, but really to make sure that besides resources that you might share, these are the three main resources I would point people to learn more. I'll say what each one is real quickly, and then Vlad and Drew, we can wrap up, or I've got time for additional questions for sure. There's a resource center that has everything. So if you want anything and everything to learn more about Microsoft Lists, go to aka.ms/mslists. We have a new blog that marked our rollout beginning to targeted release, and then the full scale of what's coming, inclusive of some of the subcomponents we may or may not have talked about today. But that's a distinct blog that has a lot of information, a lot of links to additional information. And then there's a great demo video that my peer, Michaela Barrett, did that really shows you soup to nuts, everything that's new the grow up nature from SharePoint and how you can use that value and carry it forward. And there's a really nice 15-minute video that's gotten some good feedback that it really does show a lot of what is hard to bake into a presentation like this. But if you want to see everything demo-wise, product-wise, Michaela does a wonderful job. So I'll pause there. Vlad, Drew, questions, roll out to the end of the session. I'll pause and take whatever you want to do.
All right, so we've had a ton of questions, so I've been kind of quiet trying to get through them as we could there, and trying to group some together. So there were two that I wanted to make sure we highlighted that were asked multiple times. Some of the stories people have heard or the background, like saying that Microsoft List is based on SharePoint lists, the list view threshold, and handling of large lists information. With the release of Microsoft List, has there been any changes into the back end for large list support?
Yeah, the main change that you'll see is not a limits adjustment. We do know that feedback, and that those are our longer dig projects. Getting for where we are today, had a lot of work behind it to increase the threshold, which effectively was that 5,000 view limit. Now is closer to 20,000 on normal use, but there's a lot of smarts to increase what that list view threshold is. One reminder there always is it's a view threshold. The actual container, any list that you create, whether it's a personal list or an existing list in SharePoint or a new one that you create, just like I showed you, you can have up to 30 million items in that list. The pain point, which we are well aware of, is when you start to navigate through the list and the views, whether you create your own custom views or you start to just paginate through a lot of list items. But to answer your question, the truth is they are based on the same platform, and the work that we've done is not on the limits of view items, but hopefully when you saw me working a little bit with lists, and I'll tell you, the second that you try lists in quick edit mode, a lot of the work that's been done that's kind of in that area is more the performance. So lists performance, because it's on a little bit more of a modern user interface, and a lot of the logic of how they pull and push your data to lists, especially when you're collaborating on lists with, let's say, 500 or 600 people. There's a lot of work that they've done to optimize that. But they know as far as work to be done to improve those limits. We know commonly they are specific asks for very unique use cases. From how are lists doing holistically across every single list that we just get metrics off, we know that it's not a broad scale blocker, but we do know that it's an important one for large lists. You probably share the same list resource that I do. There's a great article around working with large lists.
Yep, super
and
popular.
It highlights recent work, and it highlights obviously some of the work that you can do to navigate what is the current limit. But it is a known pain point, and it's something that we do want to get to, but nothing changes with Microsoft Lists except for what we've talked about today as far as the new value. But anyway, that's the answer.
I want to make sure people say that, and I talk to customers, and that's to me, it's been a nuance from almost like this legacy thing that keeps holding on. Mm-hmm. It's not as bad. Like you have to find a pretty unique scenario that it does cause a challenge like that, but there are ways to get around it. So don't just because it is a potential challenge, just say that's not going to work. It's had major improvements in the last 3 years. It absolutely is better than it was. So don't, just because we're saying it hasn't changed, it's still better than when I talk to a lot of customers what their experience has been in the past.
Yep, and the design around it, even though we don't want to promote that as the excuse of why we haven't made progress, because it is a bigger problem to solve. The reality is to design around it probably will map to a better user experience in the end result. So if you know there is a limit, but you also put into context if the scenario would benefit from really honing what information is displayed to an end user at a point in time, the view, think in terms of a lot of scenarios would want to report back fewer than 5,000 items. Where I see a lot of people building really unique solutions that get into these troubles with the view is the call through the Microsoft API to their unique user interface and getting blocked into what they can then make a view out of. Again, we've upped the limit, so it really isn't technically 5,000 anymore. And there's work that we did to make them smart, to kind of build the smart index on your behalf for the most common things that people do to create views or dynamically generated views. And I would just point to that article to review what we've done recently and land at least initially in trying to consider what am I trying to create. And if you're still blocked and you're still hitting that pain point, vote it up at user voice, and also know that the team is well aware of it.
And then staying on the more of the advanced side, relational information. So, so we showed kind of reusability of lists, and what about reusability of columns or relationships between lists?
Yep. So the easy answer is anything you can do today is possible in Microsoft Lists. So there is a lookups mechanism. There is the notion of column types and being able to bring that forward. I had mentioned the notion of us wanting to bring in custom list templates. That would be closer to the end of year. We haven't landed it quite yet on the roadmap, but that's something that we've lightly talked about because it's a common question. But the real value I think that people are looking for is how can I pull in data across lists a lot more easily in modernizing essentially the lookup. And this one I would defer. There's a great answer that my peer Lincoln Damaris, who is on the engineering team and a lot closer to both the ask and the current pain if you try to do it yourself. There are things that you can do today to accomplish it. It is not as easy as we're making Microsoft Lists, and that's the want. Both the want from what we hear in feedback and the want of what we want to develop. We want to make it easier to do cross-list lookups. The ones that are most common are I have a set of presenters and I want to map them to another list of sessions without having to maintain a giant choice column where I have to manually input a new speaker or a speaker left or they no longer can join the conference. There's a lot of scenarios that pain point can be made easier to manage. You can accomplish it today. You have to have closer to the maybe a pre-PhD in SharePoint lists to do it. There's a great article on how to do it, but it is also in that category of a very known element that we'd love to make and bring forward to the 21st century. I don't have much more I can share about it except for we hope lists are used like that, and going forward we hope that people really use them like that because there's a ton of value in making those connections.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I was, from my end, I'm working with that information. You definitely can use that, I guess, you can build that information inside of Microsoft Lists if you need to, or SharePoint Lists as they are today. You absolutely can, but you do need a little bit more of the functionality you could do today is not going to change with Microsoft Lists.
Well, let me put it this way. If you need the functionality today, hire Drew.
You can do that too. One came through around views. So kind of thinking about views, we know you showed some of the view potential in Microsoft Lists. Has there been any other changes that from the people that have been working with SharePoint views today? We talked about a new calendar view kind of coming. Anything else is the same view logic as it exists today, how it works in Microsoft Lists if I'm in that UI?
Yep. So it's actually more simplified. So there is kind of a new initial surface canvas so that you can either by the column structure, kind of create a view off of a column, or holistically work with the which columns are in view, what order they're in, reordering them, grouping them, filtering them, customizing the view with JSON, if you're more of a power user. All of that is possible today. Chris Kent, if you ask, can Chris Kent do his work in the community? If you don't know Chris, he does some wonderful things with lists formatting with JSON, and kind of is almost like 3 months ahead of us on each feature that he builds through JSON. We want to make that, some of those things a lot easier. But the reality is they are lists like they are lists. You can create views, you can save them as default views, you can create and customize in lots of different ways that I explained and more. And then just to reiterate, there are the 3 default ones that we will have that again were common ones that people were trying to recreate or build themselves. And I didn't really show it, but there's also a part of the templates as they come through that because we already know the structure of the columns or the schema, we already have some pre-filtered views or pre-created views that come with that template. So within a template, you can have a lot of things, the list schema, the conditional formatting, the forms themselves, the rules, and views, to your question. template oftentimes has 2 or 3 or more pre-created views based on common ways that people would want to use in that scenario. So the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Views are very important to lists. The ease of use is improving, but the common capabilities that exist will carry forward for sure.
And then when you create a view, or let's say I create a new view and I share, going back to that list UI, when you shared something, you shared that list, you're sharing the whole list. You're not actually sharing. You can't like privatize views, correct? I would, if I created our Drew and Vlad manager, I share that list to the Microsoft list team. You're sharing the list. We're not. It's not like I can create a huge list, just create a view and share it just with you, like just that view. You're
You
going to get
can't.
access to the whole
That's correct.
list. Is that
Right
correct?
now, we don't have the ability to grant permissions based on a view, and this is where I think I'm 95% right. I've heard the feedback in terms of the want to manage lots of different ways against permissions. The same capability today, if I create a view and when I leverage that broader Microsoft 365 roadmap list, I have a view that I created for myself for my sanity because there are so many things that are not SharePoint related or not list related that I'm interested in, but I don't necessarily need to work with day to day, and I don't have permissions to work on a few things. But I did create a view that I call Mark PMM that is just private view to me. So when I go to the list, I can see it in the dropdown. And if I'm repeating what everybody already knows, like that carries forward the ability to create a private view. But for me to then permission off of that, very different than for me to create a personal list that I grant Drew access to.
Yep.
It's based on the list. It's based on the list item if I'm sharing an individual list item like you saw in Teams, but the notion there is we're really looking at the collaborative way to share a list item, not necessarily the way to permission a list item. But there are a lot of things that you can do at the list item level as well that will carry forward, again, on the backbone of that sharing mechanism that the team is looking at.
On the view side, has there been any, we know we said this is not a task tracking, or not a task app. I mean, it can be, but any conversations internally around Gantt views? As I know that's been discussed, definitely in the past at SharePoint, those things have kind of crept up and been available.
Yeah, the part that I know that we want to get just better on the design surface of lists is what you've started to see us do with moving columns. So just the ability to drag and drop. One of the features that we have now, which is I think close to what you're asking, and I'll round it out to answer your question, is if you do a group by, and let's say you have 3 status in development, rolling out, launch. Those are common for me for roadmap. If I'm in one of the group views and I move an item, just like a drag and drop of a file, and I move an item from in development to rolling out, for me, it's just a visual way to say, yep, it's in that bucket, it's in that grouping of assets, and it actually updates that column status. So it goes from in development to rolling out because I moved it into that group. What's really happening is I'm bucketing items. And what a lot of people ask about, whether it's planning a project like you see in Planner, or it's just I want to move something into a field that's just a visually easy way for me to remind myself that some status has changed. I want to send a signal to the rest of the group, and be it a Gantt chart or just an easy way for people to navigate and bucket in a different visual mechanism. We get the ask specific around Gantt. We also know that we want to improve the ability to drag and drop things meaningfully. The other example is the new capability in calendar view. I can drag an item from April 3rd to April 12th. And obviously visually I drag and drop it to the date, but what happens on the back end is the actual date column changes to April 12th. So we're looking at a lot of ways to influence and visualize the data, to move things around in logical ways, and the Gantt chart mechanism or other things like Kanban or whatever might come up in people's heads is logically an area where we would want to hear what people are wanting to accomplish and put it into our best user interface in the way that we're designing lists to be more functional, to be more adoptable and adaptable, and especially when it comes to what starts off as a set of people on a simple project of tracking information to growing that up to something that requires a lot more. Anyway, long-winded answer to, we hear that feedback and we want to improve it on all fronts that would then carry over to either meeting that ask and need or to give us capabilities to do a lot more in similar fashion.
Awesome. And the last one I'm going to kind of tick over here. So thanks for staying on the extra couple minutes here, Mark.
Of course.
The last one that the questions have come through around is a little bit on governance. And I wanted to cue this up because this is one that one of the first things that came to my mind with the concept of my lists and personal lists. And how do we, the governance aspect of the answer for people who leave the organization, if you don't have proper retention or configure or retention configured on your OneDrive environment, your personal lists will go away. They will follow the life cycle of your OneDrive for that.
Correct. So we phrase it as a list is stored in your personal storage, not to just abstract away from OneDrive, but usually people, when they hear OneDrive, they think of files. But OneDrive in the same storage container effectively is where we're putting lists, and we're not shy about that. We do want to give, and we hear feedback around admin controls for how or if people can create personal lists. Some of it is just the confidence that when somebody generates and creates a personal list, where is it stored? Can I take over ownership of it? And if they leave, what happens? And the pattern that we're following is no different than how you would manage somebody's OneDrive. If they leave the company, switch roles, or if there's some greater scenario like an e-discovery or an audit that would need to take place. It doesn't break any of those boundaries from a compliance perspective. It really is additive to what you can govern. And it is something that the team is reviewing, that even though there aren't a lot of admin controls for turning lists off, there is that one to explore if a customer would want to minimize either who can create a personal list or if personal lists could be created at all. That's one admin control that the team is considering. And in fact, I answered that publicly on the blog with the engineering, both influence and input. So if you want to go track that one down, just track me down. I'll send you a link that goes right to that comment on the GA blog. The other side of governance that I just like to make clear, not just the personal lists, is think about governing Microsoft 365 groups. And if you think in notions of SharePoint team sites connected to groups, if you think about Microsoft Teams team connected to a team site, and yes, we're playing the team bingo. The reality is that is all highly governable. It has been, it continues to be, and lists being a component with inside that team site means, like the document library, like the pages, like the home page, like the app that you built inside that team site, whether you visualize it as a tab in Teams, whether you only think about it as a file in the Files tab in Teams, it's all governable, starting from who can create the group, are you a member owner, can I influence naming, all of that is applicable to lists being a part of the team site. So if you know how or are aware of how you can govern a team site, or broadly thinking of how you can govern teams, or if you're an Azure AD admin and you're monitoring and managing Microsoft 365 groups, the one key element that's really important, I've seen it come up a couple of times on the blog, is when I create a list, I'm choosing where I put it. It does not create a new Microsoft 365 group. That is not what happens. It's either in your personal storage or in an existing team space.
Good. Thanks. Great, Mark.
Awesome.
Anything else on your side, or?
No, I think
So
we really.
What's this next session you guys got coming up here?
Well,
So
Drew is the records management guy, so I'll let Drew talk about it.
I tried to queue up the records one by talking about retention. So in a couple of weeks here, we got Roberta and Tina coming in, and there's actually been a lot of update, or there's been some a bigger update actually in the records management space in Microsoft 365 in the past 2 months here. So we're going to dive into some of those capabilities as far as managing documents, and actually list items will be a part of that. And actually talking about for organizations that have been using let's say in-place records or classic records management in SharePoint on premises today, what does that world look like when you're moving into Microsoft 365?
Yeah, and I think the one plug I'll put in here is both Roberto and Tina own this space and are the right folks. You know that already. The key thing I think though is this is another area where it started off as a SharePoint content service. People used to build records management centers on SharePoint. And the work that Roberto and team have been doing is to up-level that. Microsoft 365 is where you go to create, manage, use records management. It's a wonderful up-leveling of that capability. And, I think it's wonderful what they're doing, and I think that will be a great session.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark. Actually, before we're done, I have one very important question for you.
Yes.
When are we going to start seeing the Microsoft List stickers and swag?
I'm going to cheat and show you what I think they're going to look like. A little bit back here, and if I get this just right, there is Microsoft Lists, but it's in my queue. I want to make sure that we don't start putting the swag out there before everybody can start using it. That's just not fair. That's like rubbing lemon in a sore. But there might be some List socks in planning. There might be some Lists hats. It's a beautiful icon. I tip my hat to Christopher Weimer and the team behind creating the icon. They did a really nice job of not just fitting with inside Microsoft 365, but really expounding the boundaries of what a Office icon looks like, and it's really exciting. So, yeah, I think some good swag in the future. We're not quite there yet.
I'll keep my eyes for around Ignite. That should, I think September, almost everybody should have it. So I'll keep my eyes open for the giveaways.
Good to time. So, and remember,
put it on your Christmas list that you can store in your personal
store
list.
It in Microsoft
I like
List.
that.
Maybe share it with Santa.
I'll create a Vlad List stocking, maybe.
I'm gonna add Santa into my tenant and
I'll just
share
put it
my
as
list
an
with him.
alias for Mark. I'll add it in exchange, an alias for Mark Kashman, Santa. Share the list with Santa and see if that works. So that'd be awesome.
Well, I'll say my one terrible pun that I've been reusing a couple times, which I really try not to reuse puns. But with Microsoft Lists, of course, you make a list and then you check it twice. So that's our Santa reference. So absolutely, I know it's a little, but you know what? I always think if I get an ugh or an eye roll, I'm out.
Worked.
Okay, like all three. That's the way to end it, Mark.
Yeah. Well, Drew, you got to get ready with the dad jokes. Oh, that's all I'm saying.
I've been warming them up, Vlad. Don't worry.
But thank you, Mark, again for taking the time. I know you're a super busy person, so thank you very much for taking the time for the community. Answer. I see we have over 50 questions answered today. And for everybody who's asking again, the session has been recorded. It will be sent to you by email within about 48 hours. And as well as a link to our next webinar with Roberto and Tina. So make sure you register for that one as well. And that's it. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Drew. Thank you to the 200 people that attended live and everybody who watches the recording after. And have a great day and a great week, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you both.
Thanks.
Have a good one. Bye.